Today I feel a very strong sense of pride to be hosting Tulsi Bagjiani. Um, it's easy to say that someone survived the plane crash because we've normalized it in our movies and in everyday life, in our TV series and what we watch, so that the suffering no longer becomes visible. Um, Tulsi, I cried myself when I heard her story for the first time and just felt an emotional connection through empathy and what I feel as an individual human being, because I came to understand my own suffering. And my own suffering started actually in the corporate world. And I remember the first time I crashed. I was in a position of responsibility. I was a country manager, as in a general manager position, responsible for 20 people, and I crashed. And I remember like 25 days where I could not sleep. I was in a depression. Everything was falling apart. Um, Everything fell apart. I remember there were times that I became so unconfident with my daily performance that I started doubting every single little decision that I used to make. And the level of doubt made me reach the level of making those mistakes that I was trying to avoid through anxiety. And 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 I started switching zeros. And when you're working with millions, you know what like skipping a couple of zeros like means, whether minus or plus. Either you got somebody too rich, or you got a whole bunch of people into a problem. And in that phase, there were times where I would cry at night because for 25 days I could not sleep, and I did not know what was wrong with me. I had nobody to talk to. I was in isolation. I had a revolution in my office by my team because I became so dark and negative, and my brain could not control itself to the level that I lost control over everything. And for those who know me from before, my name is Roger. I'm the founder of Reconnect. And what started at work with a burnout turned to be a loss of everything I ever knew before. And Tulsi probably went through the same experience, where you lost everything. She did lose everything. She lost her family at a very young age. Like, imagine how attached to you are on a daily basis to your mother and your father and your brother and your sister, and then suddenly they're gone. And you are, according to a lot of people, not human because you're deformed, you're different, you're ugly, and this is exactly stigma. Stigma is not just applicable to mental health, but stigma is all around us. And I wanted to welcome Tulsi by thanking her first and being grateful for her attendance and for her presence and for her enthusiasm and her excitement and for her trust in what we are doing. And I prepared something that I wanted to read in this occasion to present this new milestone in the history of Reconnect, which is a focus on where we are needed the most, at least in the UAE, where it is a very competitive and very highly professional environment that is no different than any mega city or mega country in the world in the way it performs, and therefore it's easy for people to burn out, for two reasons. One of them is that they don't know how to manage themselves, like I did not know how to manage myself. And the second is that there are cultures that are nurturing burnouts and putting them up as measures of performance. Your burnout means dedication. So I wrote something that I'd like to read, and I will give myself the liberty to read. Um, we are at a point in human collective history where we live by values we don't believe in and believe in values we don't live by. This is a statement that I wrote, and what I'm going to read for you is an opinion that does not only stem out of my theoretical studies of theosophy and spiritual science by Rudolf Steiner, and modern philosophy, in particular that of Friedrich Nietzsche, and consequently Abraham Maslow, which in particular are relevant to our topic today, but also my personal experience with mental illness and my fall from the self-actualized man at the top of the Maslowian pyramid as a leader in the corporate world and into the abyss of homelessness, poverty, and hopelessness. Only for me to realize in the end that my story is the story of millions of people, and that the only thing truthful about Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs is that it is as good as his observation of monkeys and as dull and boring as his library time, based on which his academically driven theory of humanistic psychology came to life, and which became the essence of our modern self-destructive, materialistic, egotistical social structures and corporate cultures and medical systems and legal systems and government system and organizational systems, and even, sad enough, our education systems. If American philosopher and ethnobotanist Terence McKenna had ever had the chance to review Abraham Maslow's purely academic theories stemming out of the observation of monkeys in a controlled environment, he would have said, enough bullshit. But today, the ones who are saying enough, and I will add the word bullshit, are the Gen Z of 10 years ago, whom we knew 10 years ago would stand up and say enough. But we instead try to subjugate them like Maslowian monkeys in a controlled environment into our Maslowian materialistic egoism. But they already said 10 years ago they don't want it because they are watching us and wondering how in heavens did we go so far as hell. 10 years ago, when I was in a leadership role in one of the best places I ever got the honor to work in, at Red Bull, research on Gen Z fell in our hands, and it told us that the next generation will only choose to work in what they are passionate about, that they reject the 8 to 5 model, that they demand flexibility because they want to live their life, not just work. And they want to travel the world and meet the friends that they meet online. And they clearly said that they will not burn themselves out to death and mental illness, and that their mental health is more important to them than their work and their financial well-being. So I like to call it health above wealth. And if you put that statement alone in a hierarchy, you already then probably can see the Maslowian hierarchy of needs flipping in reverse on its face. Today in 2022, those demands of 10 years ago manifested in a global revolution called the global resignation, and it is actually happening right now. And now, if you're responsible for people in a professional or corporate controlled environment, then you're in trouble because 40% of your best people are walking out on you in the next 6 months, and you'll probably only be able to replace them with power-hungry Maslow'ian monkeys. According to the Great Resignation, 73% want time and geographical flexibility. 54% seem to have learned from my story and refuse to be burnout and fall into a mental illness because of a job. Now, if we want to say that 54% of people are burning out, let's try to compare this to slavery days and see how many people have been whipped. Or let's look at the statistics of a pandemic, which is currently happening, and it did not impact probably, it did not put 54% of people into hospitals, but burnout is. So it is a pandemic. And that pandemic is very real and people don't want it anymore. And 39% want to be their authentic selves, which means they want to live by purpose and they will only do what they love to do. And this already by itself changes the Maslowian view of the human being and the organizational structures we have lived by since the Industrial Revolution to a very disruptive level that will require us to change even our worldviews and our belief systems for us to accommodate and enable that revolution. that we are in the middle of and that we can no longer subjugate but rather embrace or die along with it. Because the Great Resignation is simply trumpeting the end of an industrially driven Maslowian era that will no longer fulfill nor contain the human soul, which Abraham Maslow denied out of the human psychological equation. Exactly. Abraham Maslow denied the existence of God or any upper force or any force beyond the individual capabilities and the commitment of self individualized man and her commitment to be at the top of the hierarchy as part of an elite that you can probably associate with the words politics and patriarchy. And that patriarchy is even very much visible behind boardrooms. Um, I mean, you know, like companies have taken decisions with regards to people's lives that have been dramatic. Mass layoffs. I mean, a lot of people have been put on the street. Like a lot of people are making less money. Inflation is happening, and what is really happening to people? We're replacing them with robots and with technology. So that's like I said, patriarchy is even very much invisible behind boardrooms, where most likely the decisions are concerning layoffs, reduction in salaries, cost cutting by overloading people to the point of burnout and mental illness. Some of us thought that a pandemic can show us the face of God or the depth of our humanity, and it did with a few songs, only for us to find ourselves 2 years later with the right levels of unemployment, highest levels of unemployment in the history of mankind, coupled with an unprecedented rate of mental illness. And right now, as we speak, in many parts of the world, a food crisis driven by wars of Maslow'ian monkeys with magnitudes of Babylonian proportions, while organizations adopt the latest robots that will reduce cost and eliminate human error at the expense of human existence for the purpose of profitability and competitiveness. Now, while the Great Resignation is manifesting itself, organizations are running around shopping for mental health programs as a reactive measure. And unfortunately, most of the existing systems are based on the Maslowian humanistic worldview, and therefore, in my opinion, it will only feed on the existing power-based view of the body-mind human being, and therefore act only as temporary fire extinguishers that will most likely only serve the organization's PR image and the insurance companies that serve them as mental health becomes insurance inclusive and more people fall into mental illness in the absence of purpose and meaning, doing jobs that contradict with the human morals that served us for tens of thousands of years and that are instilled in our spirits, human nature, and even in our evolving DNA. The funny part is that we talk about bringing mental health programs and we forget that the root cause of what we know as mental health today is actually philosophy. It's psychology, it's religion, it's sociology, and the intense journeying of the human mind, starting from the Greeks and then passing through modern greats like Carl Jung and Friedrich Nietzsche, who have funny enough predicted pretty accurately enough as far as 100 years ago, and since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the fall of mankind into the trap of egotistical materialism, which led Nietzsche to say one of the most misinterpreted quotes in the history of a 30-second attention span modern humanity: God is dead. So if you want to give Nietzsche some credit for his nihilistic philosophy, which must have been expressed in more than 3 words, for him to be at least called a philosopher. So there's the full quote: God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? Now, what Nietzsche was talking about here while he was witnessing the Industrial Revolution unfold was the transformation of communities that were once living together based on clear-cut religious-driven moral values and driven economically by their God given multidimensional human nature and their individual and collective capabilities to find solutions to their daily needs, and into a unidimensional state of employment, existence, and power based patriarchal structures that have given up moral values for financial riches and economic prosperity, including the religious institutions themselves. Nietzsche witnessed the religious institutions prevalent at his time make the same transformation, and thus the start of an evolutionary pathway where people started rejecting religion altogether. But what Nietzsche warned of 100 years ago, and which Jordan Peterson speaks of today, is the vacuum that this will create in the human soul and the disappearance of the moral values that religion brought and which guided our human behavior for many tens of thousands of years. Nietzsche didn't propose a return to religion, as he saw the institutions as spiritually dead, preaching God while contributing themselves politically and economically to the materialistic ways being adopted by the rest of humanity, and therefore playing a catalytic role in the evolutionary shift into materialistic egoism and falls into its own traps. Instead, Nietzsche calls for humanity to maintain the moral values, or at least to draft a new set of moral values that guide our human existence, regulate our collective actions, and gives us the spiritual balance within communal balance. But what I really think is the most accurate statement in that entire testimony of the change of times by Nietzsche is his predictive question. Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? And here comes Abraham Maslow as an evolutionary prediction of Nietzsche, falling into the hands of an economic superpower that is the United States of America, by a traumatized Jewish immigrant who fled capture into Nazi concentration camps, abused and beaten by his mother in Brooklyn, and who ended up as an isolated person reading books in a library, which ultimately led him into a purely academic journey that involved no interaction with other human beings beyond the philosophies which influenced his research, and which he read in books and which happened to be all by American thinkers during the time of peak industrialization, while observing monkeys and with a clear-cut statement of the inexistence of God or any other force beyond the power of the individual to self-actualize himself or herself through means of positive humanistic psychology, which were the exclusive studies and contributions of Abraham Maslow, who was criticized for not contributing in any shape, way, or form to the healing from mental conditions or mental illness. And my friends, this has become our global mental health system, a godless, spiritless view of the human being where one can become God by physically and mentally nurturing skills, qualities, and modes of behavior that only serve the individual self with no healing capacities whatsoever to heal human suffering and mental conditions arising out of it. And guess what? It is now called the mental health industry. Now, the great news is that it's not all doom and gloom. And if Nietzsche announced the death of God as a warning to the death of moral values associated with God and religion, and recommended we maintain or adapt those moral values for our collective and individual spiritual well-being and mental health, then maybe we should listen to him. I mean, he predicted what we are experiencing today in terms of isolation, burnouts, depression, anxieties 100 years ago. And Nietzsche ended up in his last years withdrawn into isolation due to his incapability to find any satisfaction in friendship or in social or group interactions. And he found that all his interactions with others have become dull and void of meaning, as people were lost to egotistic materialism and the resulting fall of morality. He died alone in silence, with nothing known of his last years except his isolation from the world in disappointment. Now look around you. Look at your mothers, look at your fathers, look at your friends, and tell me how many have been filtered out of the social and the corporate systems and into isolation and poverty by the 64th year, for example. And how many are now in isolation, suffering from anxiety and depression, and even driven into suicide in the pursuit of personal materialistic fulfillment stemming out of this Maslow'ian way of life and its rigid structures that go against the nature of the human condition, its evolution, and its need for love and belonging. When Abraham Maslow was compared to Sigmund Freud, it was said that Freud gave us the ugly and dark side of humanity, while Maslow gave us the positive humanistic psychology, which helps the individual build the traits, routines, commitment, and guidance to reach the top of his self imagined spiritually void hierarchy of needs. In my opinion, as ugly as some of the truth described by Sigmund Freud, at least Freud gave us psychoanalysis and other healing tools that are still used till date to heal thousands of people, even if, in my opinion, not enough alone. However, Maslow and the consequent hierarchical systems that stemmed out of his observation of monkeys in library time gave us the illusion that we are evolving individually to the level of gods in the pursuit of power and materialistic abundance, only for us to find ourselves in isolation and loneliness and depression because it's never enough and it does not fulfill the human spirit in any shape, way, or form in the absence of divine guidance and moral correctness. If Freud showed us the dark side of humanity blatantly and honestly, then Maslow lured us all straight into hell in the process of glorifying the self actualized man and, in fact, handing even our powers and human rights to the elite that generated and degenerated out of it. I mean, look at our political systems. Look at look at our, like, the CEOs that are glorified. Look at the athletes and how they glorified. We have this glorification of the individual that has transcended our, the believable system. Like, while we know that those same leaders are destroying the planet with poverty and death and induced induced mass drugging, and then we glorify them for their achievements. But like Nietzsche, I'm not by any means recommending a return to religious institutions, because the institutions for most people are indeed dead, and dead as a result of the death of their own soul, and the millions who have been put to death and hunger under the name of pro-life, as Terence McKenna beautifully and painfully describes it, as they adopt and reinvent themselves using godless Maslow'ian institutional practices. Spiritual science, philosophy, psychology, and sociology all tell us the same thing, and that is that the divine spirit, its abundant love, and its moral values are simply to be found within ourselves, and all we need to do is to trust it and construct our own moral compass and protect our lives from what contradicts with it, especially where we work and what we create and what we produce. And when we look deeply at the Great Resignation, we see that people in huge numbers want to be their authentic selves. And this means they want to be true to their values, true to their bodies, true to their health, and true to their mental health. But most importantly, true to who they can truly become. And who they can truly become are forces for change, impact, and creative solutions that don't only contribute to company bottom lines, but to the much needed salvation that humanity is in need of and what our bleeding planet needs. And while the mainstream American symptom-based spiritless Maslow'ian mental health system becomes our unfortunate reality, from its ashes of inhumanity and mass drugging, we see a rise in the calling to bring back spirit into our lives, into our organizations, into our mental health systems, and into our world. Not all that is American is bad. American philosopher and ethnobotanist Terence McKenna in the 80s went so loud in criticizing the power-hungry institutional, hierarchical, patriarchal, and inhumane systems that are driving us to the brink of extinction and planetary destruction. And in 2020, one of the greatest explorers of our time, Sir David Attenborough, in his film A Life on Our Planet, showed us in high resolution, high accuracy, and on Netflix, the magnitude of those predictions and their threat on human existence. Fortunately enough for us, Nietzsche didn't even die in the first place, as modern thought leaders in psychology and philosophy are calling through the dark intellectual web for a return to what Terence McKenna calls an archaic revival. And this means a return to moral and social values and structures that serve humanity rather than the egotistical needs of the individual, while maintaining and protecting the authenticity of the individual human experience. Terence McKenna found his connection with the divine force through the use of psychedelic mushrooms and a curiosity to understand the purpose of life and the meaning of his existence. And he found it under a waterfall on mushrooms. Buddha found it meditating under the Bodhi tree. And Jesus found it in a rebellion against the materialistic political patriarchy prevalent at his time. If we are to ever again win back our humanity and thrive as communities, then there is a need for non-institutional return to archaic values, whether of religion or non-religion. And Terence McKenna puts that in the context of the primacy of the individual experience. It's all within us, and we experience our spirituality and our full capabilities, each in our own ways. Canadian clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson, and one of the loudest modern day thought leaders on psychology, and who's challenging the global mental health system to the point of shame and humiliation, and who became a very respected and widely known figure not overnight, but relatively quickly, but not through the support of mainstream media or the mental health industry who fights him, but rather the intellectual dark web. Also speaks of our human condition and the need for spirituality from a Christian Judaic perspective. And he clearly acknowledges the truthfulness of Nietzsche's nihilistic prediction and says, if we cannot go back to the religious morals that served us well until the Industrial Revolution, then at least let's create new ones that are equally beneficial for as many people as possible. Where we are now as a collective is what both Nietzsche and Jordan Peterson called the void, vacuum. And that void consists of a complete rejection of religious morals, but without having any alternatives to produce morally sustainable human outcomes. However, an archaic revival can simply consist of pre-industrial revolution human values that got us as far as 8 million years of human coexistence. We can adopt those values, not because they stem out of religion, just because they are values that helped us coexist for so many years. But we sold them out for paper money at the expense of forests and oxygen and power for the sake of void, self-actualization, and material possessions, and these values consist of words like honor, truthfulness. Canadian clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson, and one of the loudest modern-day thought leaders on psychology, and who is challenging the global mental health systems to the point of shame and humiliation, and who became a celebrity overnight, not through the support of the mainstream media or the mental health industry, but rather the intellectual dark web. Jordan Peterson speaks of our human condition and the need for spirituality from a Christian Judaic perspective, and he clearly acknowledges the truthfulness of Nietzsche's nihilistic predictions, and says, if we cannot go back to the religious morals that served us well until the Industrial Revolution, then at least let's create new ones that are equally beneficial for as many people as possible. Where we are now as a collective is what both Nietzsche and Jordan Peterson called the vacuum, or the void. And that void consists of a complete rejection of religious morals, but without having any alternative to produce morally sustainable human outcomes. However, an archaic revival can simply consist of re-adopting pre-industrial revolution human values that got us as far as 8 million years of human coexistence and coexistence with nature, before we sold them out for paper money at the expense of forests and oxygen, and power for the sake of void, self-actualization, and material possessions. And these values from the archaic revival come in the words like honor, truthfulness, honesty, authenticity, willpower, integrity, love, health, empathy, family, and community. Unlike Nietzsche, spiritual science looks at the death of God as a necessary means to the rebirth of God. Those of you who have fallen into mental illness and risen out of it are probably acquainted with the term the dark night of the soul. And it is that godless, lonely dark of a hell of a state of existence where suicide seems like the best thing that could happen, but only for you to find the light somehow. And when you do find that light, then this is where all the magic of life begins, in all its divine glory. The fall of humanity in the trap has happened before, and it will happen again for sure, and it's happening in our own times, which is quite magical to witness and experience. In sociology, those same patterns appear in the rise and fall of civilizations, and in various religions and mythologies represented by the stories of Armageddon. But unlike the Maslow'ian Hollywood movies where Bruce Willis saves the world out of his personal genius and superpowers, it will be all of us rising together to create the new external world that is already rising within our internal spirits and divine essence, using our collective genius and our individual superpowers. The Heartfulness Initiative for Professionals is not a mental health program of firefighting burnouts and self induced depressions, but a methodology of collective human existence and thrival that can only stem out of the primacy of the authenticity of the individual physical and spiritual experiences, their personal purpose, their imagination, and the alignment of their places of work with their personal belief systems and self constructed moral values in the absence of a religious affiliation or any commitment to existing moral values, if any. The global resignation also means that mental health, as a one size fits all methodology for addressing human suffering through diagnostics based approach to healing body and mind minus spirit in a materialistic, egotistical world, is plain bullshit. What we need is a purpose based approach to human thrival that brings back humanity to its multidimensional state of existence and that disappeared with industrialization, globalization, and robotization. And if that conflict of interest clause still lies in your recruitment contract, then it's time to throw it out because the human spirit can no longer be contained in its unidimensional identity that is linked to a career or a job or a title, nor is unidimensionality an option that employees will look positively at in light of how that clause has been used by corporations to ensure loyalty to one thing alone, and that is that you put all your time, energy, life, health to serve an organization that in return promises you the basic Maslow'ian needs of food and safety and the shelter and a promise of a leadership role until a technological solution arises where you become obsolete. People are demanding flexibility, and they are demanding flexibility for them to explore the full potential of their human existence, like being present family members, present parents, creative and artistic individuals, or influencers, or thought leaders, or singers, or even drag queens. And we can no longer contain them with slavery like clauses that are used selectively at the whims of managers and leaders to dictate how people should live outside their work environments, such as conflict of interest. The only interest people have now is finding their purpose, living a balanced life, and doing what they sincerely and authentically love to do while contributing to the wellness of their communities at large. And this is the responsibility that goes both ways, one for the individual to manifest, and the other for the organizations to offer. And the only way both can thrive is that they each take on the responsibility to create the best professional experience possible. And that's what the Heartfulness Initiative for Professionals exactly is, a solution whereby individuals can thrive within a culture that addresses the changes that the global resignation is bringing and their needs that transcend power and money. Ram Dass, and after spending many decades striving in the corporate world to give it all away in the search of meaning, yet another product of the dark intellectual web, says something along the lines of, at the end of the day, we are different souls sharing a shared space called a company office. But in that space, every one of us is hiding behind a veil. And that veil consists of titles and structural responsibilities and level of authorities that we hide behind to escape our moral responsibilities towards each other, or even to create barriers of human connection and love between each other. That veil is now falling. And it's not falling because our organizations have become more human centric or humanistic, but rather because more and more people are acknowledging the fact that humans are spiritual beings having a physical experience. And weird enough, those spirits are operating in a human body and walking around at your offices. And it's about time we see them as such and treat them as such, because this is the only way we can turn a revolution into an evolution. And last but not least, I keep mentioning the dark intellectual web. And the dark intellectual web is literally content that is growing and flourishing on channels like YouTube. And it's literally what our best people are now watching and consuming in the pursuit of their own spiritual journeys and their own archaic revival. People are full of um, capabilities and superpowers, and all we need to do is change our mind to be able to be those human beings. Thank you.